Hello everyone, welcome to Demystifying Networking, where we demystify complex networking concepts. In this video, we are going to demystify the concept of OSPF Router ID. By the end of this video, you will learn what is OSPF Router ID, where OSPF Router ID is used, criteria used for Router ID selection, followed by Router ID configuration examples in the lab, and we'll end this video with some show commands to verify Router ID. So let's see what is OSPF Router ID. The OSPF Router ID is a 32-bit number that uniquely identifies an OSPF router in an OSPF domain. Router ID is represented in a dotted decimal notation similar to IP addresses, such as A.B.C.D, where A, B, C, and D values are in the range of 0 to 255. You can see examples of router ID in the sample topology. An important point to remember about the OSPF router ID is, even though it looks like an IPv4 address, it is not an IPv4 address. It is an identifier. Now let's see where OSPF router ID is used. OSPF router ID is used to uniquely identify an OSPF router in the link state database. It is also used as a link state ID of router LSA and ASVR summary LSA. OSPF router ID is also used to identify advertising router of an LSA in a link state database. The OSPF router ID is also used to identify the OSPF neighbors as shown in the show IP OSPF neighbor command output. Every OSPF packet has a fixed 24-byte header, and OSPF router ID is used to identify the source of that packet. OSPF router ID is also used to elect DR and BDR on a multi-access network when the interface priorities are equal. As shown in the sample topology, router 1, router 2, and router 3 are connected to a multi-access network. The interface priorities on all three routers are equal, and to select DR and BDR, router ID is used. In this scenario, router 3 has the highest router ID, so router 3 is elected as a DR. Router 2 is elected as a backup designated router because it has a second highest router ID. Another use case for OSPF router IDs is virtual link endpoints. In this sample topology, a virtual link is created between router 2 and router 3, and the respective router IDs are used as the virtual link endpoints. Now let's see how an OSPF router ID is assigned. OSPF router ID is selected using the following criteria. Router prefers the router ID specified using the router ID command under router OSPF configuration mode. If the router ID is not explicitly configured, the router considers the highest IPv4 address among all active loopback interfaces on a router as the router ID. In case there is neither router ID configured explicitly nor any active loopback interface exists on the router, the highest IPv4 address among all active non-loopback interfaces on a router is considered as the router ID. Now let's see how router ID is explicitly configured under router OSPF configuration mode. Now that we have configured the router ID, let's verify the router ID. As you can see, the router ID is set to 11.11.11.11 as configured using the explicit router ID command. Let's consider a scenario where router ID is not explicitly configured. As you can see, there is no explicit router ID command under router OSPF. In this case, let's see which number is used by router R1 as a router ID. The command output confirms that 2.2.2.2 is used as a router ID by router R1. Let's verify what this number is. As you can see, the router ID is an IPv4 address configured on the loopback1 interface. And this confirms that when you don't have an explicit router ID configured, the router chooses the highest IPv4 address among all the active loopback interfaces as the router ID. Let's consider another scenario where we don't have explicit router ID configured and we also don't have any loopback interface configured on the router. So this command output confirms that there is no explicit router ID configured. Now let's verify if there is any loopback interface configured on router 1. As you can see, there is no loopback interface on router 1. In this case, let's verify which number is used by router R1 as the router ID. The command output confirms that router R1 has selected 10.1.5.1 as the router ID. Let's verify what this number is. As you can see, that number is an IPv4 address configured on the Gigabit Ethernet 0/3 interface of router R1. And this confirms that when you don't have explicit router ID configured and you also don't have any loopback interface configured on the router chooses the highest IPv4 address among all active non-loopback interfaces as the router ID. Now let's see some show commands that can be used to verify the router ID on the routers. The first command is show IP protocols. The second command is show IP OSPF. The third command is show IP OSPF interface. And the fourth command is show IP OSPF database. So you can use any of these four commands to verify the router ID. The lessons learned in this video are: the OSPF router ID is a 32-bit number that uniquely identifies an OSPF router in an OSPF domain. Even though router ID looks like an IPv4 address, it is not an IPv4 address. It is an identifier. Router ID is used for below purposes. And there are three criteria to select a router ID. If you found this video useful, please like and share this video and subscribe to Demystifying Networking for more such useful content.